Sometimes the strongest move isn't confrontation or closure, it's quiet withdrawal. When you disappear calmly and choose your peace, you don't just step away from the situation, you remove your emotional presence. And that absence is what an ego feels most deeply. Silence is often misunderstood as weakness because we live in a world that rewards explanation, justification, and emotional display. We're taught that if something matters, we must fight for it, argue our point, or demand to be understood. But there is a profound difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from self-respect. Disappearing quietly is not about shutting down or avoiding feelings. It's about recognizing when further words would only cost you your dignity. It's the moment you realize that your energy is valuable and not everyone deserves access to it simply because they once had it. When someone stops listening to you, stops showing up consistently, or begins to take your presence for granted, continuing to explain yourself often becomes an act of self-betrayal. You start repeating the same feelings, the same needs, the same boundaries, hoping that if you say it one more time, it will finally land. But self-respect asks a different question. How many times do I need to express something before I accept the answer I'm being shown? Silence in this context is not passive. It is an active decision to stop offering emotional labor to someone who is no longer treating it with care. Quietly disappearing is also about trusting yourself enough to walk away without needing validation. Ego thrives on reaction. It feeds on emotional responses, anger, tears, long messages, dramatic goodbyes, because all of those confirm relevance. Even conflict keeps a connection alive. Silence removes that fuel entirely. When you stop engaging, you're not trying to punish the other person. You're simply choosing not to participate in a dynamic that diminishes you. That choice alone signals a level of self-worth that doesn't need to be announced. Self-respect is deeply unsettling to ego because it introduces a boundary that cannot be negotiated. Arguments can be twisted, emotions can be dismissed, and explanations can be ignored, but silence leaves no room for manipulation. It says without words, I see what this is, and I'm opting out. That clarity forces reflection because there is no longer anything to push against. The absence itself becomes the message, and it lingers far longer than any speech ever could. There's also a powerful internal shift that happens when you choose silence from self-respect. You stop centering your emotional world around whether you are understood or chosen. Instead, you center it around whether you feel aligned with your own values. That alignment brings calm. You're no longer waiting for responses, replaying conversations, or questioning whether you said the right thing. You know that your silence is not confusion, it's a conclusion, and that certainty restores a sense of control, not over the other person, but over yourself. Quiet withdrawal also protects your future self. When you leave with anger or desperation, you often carry shame or regret afterward, wishing you had handled things differently. Silence rooted in self-respect leaves you with peace. You know you didn't abandon yourself to be heard. You didn't beg for clarity from someone who was unwilling to give it. You honored your emotional boundaries even when it was uncomfortable. That integrity becomes part of how you see yourself moving forward. Ultimately, disappearing quietly is an act of emotional maturity. It recognizes that not every situation requires a final word, and not every connection deserves continued access. Silence becomes a boundary, not a weapon. It reflects a deep understanding that your worth is not measured by how loudly you protest mistreatment, but by how calmly you remove yourself from it. When you choose self-respect over explanation, you don't just walk away from someone else, you walk back toward yourself. Anger often feels powerful because it is loud, expressive, and immediate. It gives the illusion of strength, as though raising your voice or expressing outrage will finally make someone understand what they're losing. But anger, especially when directed at someone whose ego thrives on control, often does the opposite. It keeps you emotionally present. It signals that they still matter enough to provoke a reaction. Ego doesn't fear anger, it feeds on it. What ego truly struggles with is absence, the quiet removal of emotional access. When you express anger, even justified anger, you are still participating in the dynamic. You are still responding, still investing energy, still engaging in a back and forth that confirms relevance. To ego, any reaction is better than none. Tears, accusations, long explanations, and emotional confrontations all communicate the same underlying message. You still have the power to affect me. That reassurance softens the impact of loss because it keeps the emotional door open, even if the interaction itself is unpleasant. Absence works differently. Absence removes context, feedback, and emotional cues. It creates a vacuum where certainty once existed. Ego is deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty because it cannot control it. When you disappear quietly, there is no argument to win, no emotion to dismiss, no narrative to twist. There is only the undeniable reality that access has been revoked. That is when loss begins to be felt, not as a dramatic moment, but as a slow, unsettling realization. The absence forces reflection because it eliminates distraction. Without your reactions, there is nothing external to focus on. Ego must turn inward, questioning what changed and why. That internal questioning is far more powerful than any confrontation because it is self-generated. It cannot be silenced or argued against. The mind begins to replay moments, recognize patterns, and confront the possibility that the connection was undervalued. This is the space where true awareness can emerge, not through force, but through stillness. Absence also reclaims your power by shifting where the emotional weight lies. When you're angry, you carry the burden of expression. You hold the tension in your body, the thoughts in your mind, and the lingering emotions long after the interaction ends. When you step into absence, that weight transfers. You are no longer carrying the emotional labor alone. The unanswered questions, the sudden silence, and the lack of access create discomfort on the other side. And that discomfort is not something you have to manufacture. It arises naturally. What makes absence so effective is its authenticity. It cannot be faked or exaggerated without effort. You are not performing a reaction. You are simply choosing not to engage. That choice is sustainable because it is rooted in self-preservation rather than emotional exhaustion. Over time, absence becomes the new reality, not a tactic, and because it is consistent, the loss becomes real. Ego can dismiss a single argument, but it cannot ignore a lasting change in access. There is also dignity in absence that anger rarely provides. Anger often exposes vulnerability in a way that can later feel uncomfortable. Absence, on the other hand, preserves your self-respect. You leave without needing to prove a point or get the last word. You allow your behavior to speak for you. That quiet confidence is disarming because it suggests that your life is continuing, uninterrupted by the need for validation or closure. Ultimately, ego feels absence more deeply than anger because absence removes relevance. It signals that the connection no longer occupies space in your emotional world. That realization cannot be rushed or forced. It unfolds over time, and while anger may create noise, absence creates meaning. It is the difference between a temporary reaction and a permanent shift. When you choose absence, you don't just express displeasure, you redefine access, and that is what makes the loss impossible to ignore. There is a subtle but powerful distinction between announcing your exit and simply living it. Announcements are often driven by a desire to be understood, validated, or remembered in a specific way. They come with explanations, justifications, and sometimes ultimatums. While this can feel necessary in the moment, it often keeps you emotionally tethered to the very dynamic you're trying to leave. Living your exit, on the other hand, requires no audience. It's a quiet, consistent shift in behavior that speaks far louder than any declaration ever could. When you announce your departure, you invite negotiation. You create space for debate, persuasion, promises, and emotional back and forth. Ego thrives in this space because it believes it can regain control. Even if the conversation is painful, the fact that it exists reassures ego that access is still possible. Living your exit removes that possibility. There is no dramatic moment to dissect, no speech to reinterpret. There is simply a change in availability, presence, and priority that becomes impossible to ignore over time. Living your exit means aligning your actions with your truth rather than trying to convince someone of it. You stop explaining why you're pulling back and instead allow your behavior to reflect your decision. Messages go unanswered or are answered with neutrality. Invitations are declined without elaborate excuses. Emotional engagement is replaced with calm distance. These choices are not meant to send a message, yet they inevitably do. They communicate that your life no longer revolves around maintaining access to someone who is not meeting you with the same care. One of the reasons living your exit is so effective is because it is grounded in consistency. Words can be dismissed, promises can be doubted, and emotional statements can be minimized. Behavior, especially when sustained, is undeniable. When someone sees that your presence is no longer guaranteed and your energy is no longer available on demand, the shift becomes real. Ego struggles with this because there is no single moment to challenge or argue against. The reality unfolds quietly, day by day, through absence and change. Living your exit, it also protects you from emotional whiplash. Announced exits often come with dramatic emotions that can pull you back in. There is a surge of adrenaline, followed by doubt, guilt, or second guessing. When you live your exit, the transition is steadier. You give yourself time to adjust, to grieve, and to refocus without creating unnecessary emotional spikes. This makes the separation more sustainable and far healthier for your long-term well-being. There is also a deep sense of self-trust that develops when you choose actions over announcements. You no longer rely on someone else's acknowledgement to validate your decision. You don't need them to agree, understand, or apologize for you to move forward. That independence is profoundly empowering. It signals that your choices are rooted in self-respect rather than reaction. Ego senses this shift because it can no longer influence you through words alone. Living your exit, it changes how you see yourself as well. You begin to identify as someone who honors their boundaries quietly and confidently. You stop seeking closure from conversations that never truly close anything. Instead, you create closure through alignment between what you feel and how you act. That alignment brings peace, clarity, and a sense of internal coherence that words alone could never provide. Over time, living your exit, it becomes a form of emotional leadership. You show, through example, what it looks like to choose dignity over drama. You demonstrate that real strength doesn't need to be announced, it is embodied. And as your life continues to expand without the weight of constant explanation, the message becomes unmistakable. You didn't leave to be seen. You left to be true to yourself, and that truth resonates far beyond any farewell ever could. Consistency is the difference between a temporary reaction and a permanent shift. Many people pull away emotionally for a few days, create distance for a moment, or go quiet when emotions are high, only to reappear once the discomfort settles in. That kind of disappearing doesn't create impact because it lacks stability. Ego learns quickly that the absence is not real, just a phase. But when disappearance is consistent, calm, and unwavering, the loss becomes undeniable. Consistency removes hope of return, and that is when ego truly begins to feel the weight of what's gone. Mixed signals are comforting to ego. They suggest that access is still possible, that the door is not fully closed. Even sporadic messages, emotional check-ins, or moments of availability reassure ego that it still matters in your emotional world. Consistency removes that reassurance. When your behavior aligns day after day with your decision to step back, it creates clarity. There is no confusion about where you stand because your actions tell the same story repeatedly. That clarity, while healthy, is deeply uncomfortable for ego because it leaves no room for fantasy or control. Consistency also shifts responsibility. When you disappear inconsistently, the emotional burden stays with you. You are constantly recalibrating, wondering when to respond, how much to share, or whether to pull back again. Consistency simplifies everything. You make one decision and then allow your behavior to support it. This frees mental and emotional space, giving you peace and stability. Meanwhile, ego is left to process the absence without any emotional cues from you, which intensifies the experience of loss. There is a psychological impact to steady absence that intermittent distance cannot replicate. Intermittent withdrawal creates anticipation and keeps hope alive. Ego interprets it as a challenge rather than a conclusion, but consistent disappearance communicates finality without confrontation. It signals that the dynamic has changed in a way that is not dependent on mood, conflict, or circumstance. That realization forces ego to confront reality rather than waiting for another emotional opening. Consistency also protects your self-respect. When you disappear and then return repeatedly, it can undermine your confidence and create internal conflict. You may begin to doubt your own boundaries or feel disappointed in yourself for re-engaging. Consistent behavior reinforces trust in yourself. Each day you honor your decision, you strengthen your sense of integrity. That inner alignment is grounding and empowering, and it becomes visible in how you carry yourself, even in silence. Ego often relies on unpredictability to maintain relevance. It watches for emotional fluctuations, hoping for moments of weakness or longing. Consistency removes that leverage. When there are no spikes in emotion and no sudden reappearances, ego has nothing to react to. The absence becomes the new normal. And it is within that normality that the loss is fully felt, not as a dramatic shock, but as a steady realization that something once available is no longer accessible. Consistency does not require coldness or cruelty. It is not about ignoring with resentment or punishing through silence. It is about choosing alignment over impulse. Your consistent disappearance is a reflection of your clarity, not your anger. That distinction matters because it allows you to move forward without carrying bitterness. You are not withholding to provoke, you are withdrawing to protect your peace. Over time, consistency reshapes the entire emotional landscape. The dynamic no longer revolves around reaction or response. It becomes grounded in reality, and in that reality, ego has no choice but to acknowledge the loss. There are no mixed messages to cling to, no emotional threads to pull, just the quiet, undeniable truth that your presence is no longer part of the equation. That is when the impact becomes real, lasting, and impossible to ignore. Peace has a way of speaking without raising its voice. When you stop reacting, stop explaining, and stop emotionally chasing clarity, your calm becomes a message in itself. It tells a story of self-worth, emotional maturity, and inner alignment that words could never fully capture. Ego is accustomed to noise. It understands arguments, emotional swings, and dramatic exchanges because those are familiar territories where it knows how to operate. Peace, however, removes the battlefield entirely, and without a battlefield, ego has nowhere to stand. When you are reactive, even in pain, your emotions still revolve around the other person. Your mood rises and falls based on their actions, responses, or silence. That emotional dependency gives ego a sense of importance, but when you become peaceful, something profound shifts. Your emotional state stabilizes independently of what they do or don't do. You are no longer waiting for messages, replaying conversations, or needing reassurance to feel grounded. That self-contained calm signals that your emotional center has moved back inside yourself. Peace communicates boundaries more effectively than confrontation ever could. Confrontation invites debate. It gives ego something to push against, dismiss, or manipulate. Peace offers no such opportunity. When you respond with calm neutrality or not at all, there is nothing to argue with. Your lack of reaction makes it clear that certain behaviors no longer earn your emotional engagement. That clarity can be deeply unsettling because it removes the illusion of influence. Ego begins to realize that it no longer has the power to disturb your inner state. Your peace also reframes the narrative. Instead of appearing hurt, desperate, or resentful, you appear composed and self-assured. This doesn't mean you weren't affected. It means you chose to process your emotions privately rather than perform them publicly. That choice communicates strength. It shows that you are capable of holding your feelings without needing someone else to fix or validate them. Ego struggles with this because it relies on emotional dependency to feel significant. There is also a quiet confidence that accompanies genuine peace. It shows up in how you move through your day, how you speak, and how you prioritize yourself. You are no longer over-explaining or justifying your choices. You trust them. That trust in yourself is palpable, even in silence. And when someone senses that you no longer need their approval or attention to feel whole, it shifts how they perceive their role in your life. Peace becomes especially powerful because it is sustainable. Emotional reactions burn out quickly and often leave regret behind. Peace, once cultivated, creates momentum. Each calm response reinforces the next. Over time, your peace becomes consistent, not situational. That consistency sends a clear message. Your well-being is no longer negotiable. Ego cannot compete with that because it thrives on volatility, not stability. What makes peace so impactful is that it is not performative. You are not trying to show how unbothered you are, you simply are. This authenticity makes the message undeniable. There is no attempt to provoke jealousy or regret. You are focused on your own alignment, growth, and emotional safety. And that inward focus naturally shifts the dynamic outward without effort. Ultimately, your peace becomes the loudest statement because it represents emotional independence. It tells the story of someone who has reclaimed their power without force, drama, or explanation. Ego feels the loss not because you disappeared with anger, but because you disappeared into yourself. And in doing so, you demonstrated that your calm, your boundaries, and your self-respect are no longer available for disruption. Self-respect is the foundation upon which all emotional independence is built, and it is the ultimate force behind disappearing quietly. When you prioritize your own dignity, you are making a statement that no one else can dictate the terms of your presence, attention, or energy. Ego thrives on access, on the ability to manipulate, provoke, or influence through emotional leverage. The moment you choose yourself, without bitterness or explanation, you remove that leverage entirely. Self-respect transforms withdrawal from a tactical move into a permanent shift in the emotional landscape. Choosing yourself is not about punishment or revenge. It's not about proving a point or making someone feel regret. It is about acknowledging that your energy and peace are finite resources and that they deserve protection. Ego often assumes that access to you is limitless, that your care, time, and attention can always be drawn upon. When you assert self-respect by quietly stepping back, that assumption is shattered. The absence becomes real, steady, and undeniable, forcing a confrontation with the reality that your engagement is no longer available on demand. Self-respect also redefines how you measure success in the dynamic. It's no longer about whether the other person understands you, reacts to you, or validates your worth. It's about whether your choices align with your values, boundaries, and emotional integrity. This shift removes dependency on external validation, which is precisely what ego feeds on. Without reactions to manipulate or provoke, ego is left to experience the consequences of its behavior without interference. That is the subtle but profound power of self-respect. It changes the rules entirely without having to argue, justify, or dramatize. One of the most striking effects of self-respect is that it naturally alters behavior in a way that words cannot. You don't have to announce that you're stepping back, you don't have to explain why, and you don't need to defend your decision. Your consistent choice to prioritize your own peace becomes the message. This kind of quiet authority is disarming because it is not performative, it is authentic. It communicates boundaries, standards, and dignity in a way that is impossible for ego to ignore or rationalize away. Self-respect also protects your emotional well-being. When you center yourself, you prevent burnout, resentment, and emotional whiplash. You stop over-explaining, chasing responses, or replaying conversations in your mind. You create space to heal, reflect, and grow without being tethered to someone else's behavior. Ego, which thrives on volatility and reaction, finds this absence destabilizing. It cannot provoke, confuse, or manipulate a person who is guided by internal standards rather than external whims. Over time, self-respect reshapes the dynamic permanently. It teaches that access to your presence is conditional, earned, and never guaranteed. It removes the illusion that emotional influence can be assumed simply because it existed before. When consistently upheld, self-respect creates a quiet, undeniable authority. The person who owns their boundaries, honors their peace, and refuses to negotiate their dignity. That authority is magnetic and disruptive at the same time, leaving ego powerless and forced to confront the consequences of its assumptions. Importantly, self-respect is sustainable. Emotional reactions, dramatic exits, or confrontational displays may feel immediate and powerful, but they are temporary and exhausting. Self-respect, when embodied consistently, becomes a lifestyle. It reinforces clarity, focus, and composure every day. Each act of quiet withdrawal, each choice to protect your peace, compounds into a presence that is unwavering and impossible to manipulate. Ultimately, self-respect is the cornerstone of disappearing quietly because it is the anchor that holds your dignity intact. By prioritizing your own emotional integrity above the expectations, demands, or ego of others, you create a shift that is felt long after you have left the scene. Your absence is no longer a temporary reaction, it becomes a permanent recalibration, a clear statement that your boundaries, your peace, and your worth are not negotiable. Ego feels the loss most acutely when it encounters someone who will no longer allow themselves to be controlled, manipulated, or diminished, and that is the ultimate power of self-respect. Disappearing quietly is not about drama, confrontation, or proving a point. It's about reclaiming your peace, dignity, and self-respect. By stepping back with calm consistency, prioritizing your own well-being, and letting your absence speak for itself, you shift the dynamic and leave ego powerless. True strength is shown not in noise or reaction, but in the quiet authority of someone who knows their worth and refuses to compromise it.